If you have ever read the Gospels, you have already met the man in this story. You met him at the worst moment of his life, in a single sentence, and you almost certainly did not notice. In the year 62 in Jerusalem, he was dragged in front of the high priest's court, condemned in a matter of hours, and stoned to death. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote it down about 30 years later, and he didn't identify the dead man by his trade, or his title, or his father. He identified him by his brother, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. 3 decades before that morning, the same man had crossed 30 miles of Galilee on foot with the rest of his family for one reason: to find his brother, take hold of him, and bring him home before he destroyed all of them, because they were convinced he had lost his mind. 2 separate sources say so, written decades apart in different countries, by people with no earthly reason to invent it. So how do you get from one to the other? Nobody wrote it down. His name was James, except it wasn't. In his own house, in his own language, nobody ever called him that. He was Yaakov, Jacob. The name traveled from Hebrew into Greek, from Greek into a late Latin variant, from Latin into Old French, and by the time it reached English, it had been worn down into something his mother would not have recognized. Every time you read the name James in the New Testament, the man behind it was called Jacob. Hold on to that, because the name is the smallest thing the tradition quietly changed about him. The Gospel of Mark is the earliest gospel we have. Most scholars date it somewhere around the year 70, give or take a decade, and it is short, blunt, and in a permanent hurry. It has no birth story, no genealogy, no infancy tradition. It is not interested in softening anything. Which is exactly why the single most damaging sentence ever written about the family of Jesus survives in Mark, intact, and survives almost nowhere else in one piece. Early in the book, Jesus goes home to a house in Capernaum, and the crowd gets so dense that he and his students can't even eat. And then Mark drops a single sentence that the church has been arguing about ever since. His own people heard about it, and they went out to seize him, because they were saying he was out of his mind. 2 phrases carry the weight. The first is hoi par autou, which literally means the ones from beside him. In ordinary Greek of the period, it meant your household, your family, the people who share your name and your reputation, and who lose it when you lose it. The second is exeste. It's the root that gives us the word ecstasy, and it means to stand outside yourself, to be displaced from your own mind. In the 1st century, applied to a man drawing crowds and casting out demons, it carried a very specific accusation: madness or possession, and in that world those 2 things were barely distinguishable from each other. And the verb Mark uses for what they intended to do to him, kratasai, is the same verb he uses later for the arrest in the garden. I mean, think about that for a second. The first people in Mark's Gospel who go out with the intention of physically restraining Jesus are his own relatives, years before either the Romans or the temple authorities get around to it. There is a fair objection to raise here, and honest scholarship raises it. The Greek is genuinely ambiguous about who says the words. It can be read as the family going out because other people were saying he was out of his mind, rather than the family saying it themselves. That reading exists. It has serious defenders. But it also happens to be the reading that rescues the family from the accusation, and you should notice how often in the history of this verse the preferred solution is the one that makes the awkwardness go away. Now hold that sentence next to another one, written by the same movement, about the same man. In the book of Acts, Peter escapes from prison in the middle of the night, arrives at a safe house, gives one instruction, and disappears. Tell James and the brothers. No introduction, no explanation of who this man is or why he outranks everyone in the room. The author of Acts simply assumes you already know that the movement in Jerusalem now answers to a man named Jacob, the relative who came to take him away by force, and the man the church in Jerusalem takes its orders from. Same person, about 15 years apart. And nobody anywhere in the New Testament explains the distance between the two. That is what makes Jacob of Nazareth one of the strangest figures in the entire Christian story. Not because of what he did, because of the hole where his explanation should be. Mark knows exactly what he's doing with that sentence. He has a habit that scholars call intercalation, which is a technical word for a very simple trick. He starts a story, interrupts it with a second story, then returns to finish the first. He does it so the two halves comment on each other. So watch the construction. The family sets out from Nazareth. Cut. A delegation of religious experts arrives from Jerusalem and announces that Jesus is working with the prince of demons. Cut back. The family has arrived, and they are standing outside the house, sending word in. The professional accusation and the family accusation are welded together on purpose. Mark is telling you they amount to roughly the same verdict, delivered by two groups who agreed on nothing else in the world. And when the message comes in, Jesus looks at the people sitting on the floor around him, the ones with no blood claim on him at all, and he redraws the family line straight through his own household. Whoever does what God wants is my brother and my sister and my mother. His mother is standing in the street. His brothers are standing in the street. And they are not invited in. Mark never tells us they came inside. He never tells us what was said afterward, or whether anything was said at all. He just moves on to the next thing, and the family walks out of the narrative with the door still shut behind them. Now, if that line were invented, someone would have removed it. That's usually how this works. Inconvenient material in ancient religious texts tends to quietly evaporate over a few generations. Except in this case, we can actually watch people trying. Matthew uses Mark as a source. He keeps the scene where the mother and brothers arrive and get left outside. He keeps the redrawn family, and he silently drops the sentence about the household setting out to seize him for insanity. It is simply gone. Luke goes further. He keeps a version of the mother and brothers scene, but he sands the edges off it so thoroughly that it almost reads as a compliment. There is no restraint in it, and no madness. In Luke, Jesus says his mother and his brothers are the ones who hear God's word and act on it. And you could walk straight past the verse without noticing that anything uncomfortable had ever happened there. Then there are the manuscripts themselves. In one Western family of texts, including Codex Bezae and a group of old Latin copies, Mark's sentence doesn't say that his own people went out to seize him. It says the scribes and the others did. One phrase swapped. The family lifted out of the verse entirely, and the blame handed to a group of professional opponents who were already cast as the villains of the story. Even the King James Version, more than 1,000 years after that, renders the phrase as his friends, not his household, his friends. You'd think somebody would eventually have made a fuss about all this rearranging. For most of 2 millennia, mostly nobody did. And here is what makes the line interesting rather than merely awkward. Historians who work on early Christian texts use a rough working principle, sometimes called the criterion of embarrassment. If a detail actively damages the group that preserved it, that group almost certainly did not invent it. Nobody sits down to compose a founding story and decides the winning move is to record that the founder's own family thought he was mentally ill, which means the line is very probably older than the gospel it sits in. It survived because by the time anyone thought to tidy it up, too many people already knew it. If Mark were the only witness, you could argue about it forever. He isn't. The Gospel of John comes from a different stream of tradition, written decades later, with a different theology, a different vocabulary, and a different set of sources. John and Mark disagree about a lot. They agree about this. Halfway through John's Gospel, at the festival of Sukkot, the brothers of Jesus tell him to leave Galilee and go up to Judea and put on a real display, because nobody who wants to be publicly known does anything in a corner. And then the narrator adds one line in his own voice with no softening at all. Not even his brothers believed in him. Two independent early sources. One says the family tried to bring him home by force. The other says the brothers, plural, did not believe. Neither of them is trying to make a point about James. Both of them are simply reporting the situation as an established fact that their readers already knew. So who exactly went out that day? A few chapters after the intervention, Mark gives us the household, and he does it through an insult. The villagers of Nazareth, offended that a local tradesman is teaching in their synagogue, list his relatives out loud to cut him down to size. The carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of Jacob and Joseph and Judah and Simeon, and his sisters, plural, unnamed, still living among them. One of those names is about to matter more than all the others, and the reason has almost nothing to do with religion. At least 7 children, possibly more, and every one of the boys carries the name of a patriarch or of a son of the patriarch Jacob. Some of that is just fashion, because those were among the most common names in Galilee at the time, but it is also a statement of identity. This was a household that named its sons after the founding story of Israel, in a province under occupation, in a generation that had not stopped hoping the story might start up again. Which makes the first name on the list worth sitting with for a moment: Jacob. The brother listed before all the others, which in a first-century list very probably means the eldest of them. 30 years later, he would be running the Jerusalem church. 50 years later, a Roman historian's Jewish counterpart would record his judicial murder. 400 years later, he would have a reputation for holiness so extreme that pilgrims told stories about the calluses on his knees. And on the day Mark is describing, he was walking a day and a half north across Galilee to collect his brother and take him home before the family lost everything. Before any of that could be undone, there was a village of a few hundred people, a workshop, a father who disappears from the record, and a family already carrying a whisper it could not shake off. Nazareth is not in the Hebrew Bible. It isn't in Josephus, who lists dozens of Galilean towns, and once claims to have commanded the military affairs of the entire region. It isn't in the earliest rabbinic sources. For a settlement that would eventually give its name to an entire religion in several languages, the written record of first-century Nazareth is close to nothing. What we have instead is dirt. Excavations in and around the modern city have turned up rock-cut tombs, storage silos, cisterns, olive and grape presses, agricultural terraces, and the remains of a small number of modest dwellings built partly against the natural rock. There are no public buildings of any significance, no paved streets, no inscriptions, and no sign of wealth anywhere in it. Estimates of the population vary a great deal, depending on who is doing the estimating, but nobody serious puts it above a few hundred people, and many put it lower. That number is the single most important fact in this section, and it explains behavior that otherwise looks monstrous. In a village of that size, there is no such thing as a private life. Everyone knows whose field borders whose, who owes what to whom, whose daughter is of marriageable age, and whose son has a temper. Reputation was the mechanism by which you got credit, labor, marriages, and help when the harvest failed. And in that world, reputation belonged to households rather than to the people inside them. This is the part that is genuinely hard to feel from the modern side of things. We are trained to think of a family's disgrace as unfortunate for the family and irrelevant to everyone else in it. That is not how honor worked in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century. Honor was collective and it was finite. Your brother's shame was your shame in the literal and practical sense that it changed how people treated you, whether they would do business with you, and whether they would let their children marry yours. Keep that in your head, because everything that follows runs on it. Mark calls Jesus a tekton. English Bibles almost always translate that as carpenter, which is not wrong so much as too narrow. A tekton was a builder and a maker who worked in wood and often in stone. Roofing beams, door frames, plows, yokes, threshing sledges, furniture, repairs. The 2nd century writer Justin Martyr says he made plows and yokes, which may be genuine memory or may be pious invention, but it is at least the right shape of work. It was a real trade with real skill in it, and it sat low on the social ladder, somewhere between destitution and land. The kind of household that eats and works constantly and has very little margin. 4 miles north of Nazareth, close enough to walk before breakfast, Herod Antipas was rebuilding the city of Sepphoris on a grand scale. Josephus later called it the ornament of all Galilee. Construction on that scale needs builders, and it needs them for years. Whether Joseph and his sons ever worked there is a guess, and you should treat it as a guess, because no ancient source says so. But it is a reasonable one, and it produces a picture worth holding. A family of laborers from a village with no name, walking to and from a Greek-style city with a theater and colonnades, watching Roman client kingship being built stone by stone, and going home at night to a house with an earth floor. Joseph appears in the birth narratives. He appears in the story of the 12-year-old in the temple, and then he is gone. He is never mentioned as living during the public ministry. Mary is there, the brothers are there, the sisters are there. Joseph is absent from every scene, including the ones where his presence would be expected, and his absence is conspicuous. The overwhelming consensus, held by scholars of every persuasion, is that he died at some point before the ministry began. That single fact reorganizes the whole household. In a 1st century Jewish family, the death of the father transfers responsibility to the sons in order of age. The eldest inherits the workshop, the debts, the obligation to feed his mother, and the duty to see his sisters married. It is a job, and it does not end until you die or the last dependent is settled. Then one day, the man carrying that job walked out of the village and went to live 30 miles away on the lake. This part almost never makes it into the retellings. Whatever else the family was reacting to, they were reacting to that. A household lost its principal earner and its legal head in a subsistence economy, with a widowed mother and unmarried daughters still in the house. The next brother in line inherited all of it at once. That brother, on the most natural reading of the lists, was Jacob. One more thing in the villagers' insult deserves a slow look. They call him the son of Mary, in a culture that identified men by their fathers as reflexively as we identify them by surnames. That phrasing is odd. Sons were called son of Joseph, son of Zebedee, son of Alphaeus, even long after the father had died. Matthew, writing later and using Mark, changes it to the carpenter's son. Some manuscripts of Mark itself read the son of the carpenter and of Mary, which looks a great deal like a scribe reaching for the expected formula. There are two ordinary explanations and one uncomfortable one. The ordinary explanations are that Joseph had been dead long enough that people had stopped mentioning him, or that the villagers named the mother because she was the one still standing in front of them. The uncomfortable explanation is that the phrasing was a jab. Identifying a man by his mother in that setting could carry an implication about whose son he actually was. And it is at least interesting that in John's Gospel, during an argument, the crowd tells Jesus that they were not born of sexual immorality, with the emphasis landing on the word they. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the sort of thing that gets stated as fact on the internet, and it isn't one. It is an inference from a change of formula and a possible barb in a different gospel. It cannot be proved, and it should not be sold as proven. But if there was a whisper attached to that house, then everything the family did afterward starts to look less like malice and more like exhaustion. A household with a dead father, a strained reputation, and a first son who has abandoned the workshop to announce the arrival of God's kingdom in front of paying crowds. Now we hit the oldest argument in the entire subject, and it changes the psychology of the story completely depending on which way you go. Who were these brothers? There are three answers, and all three are ancient. The first is what most Protestants and most critical historians hold today, and it says exactly what it looks like it says. Joseph and Mary had children after Jesus, and the brothers in the Gospels are those children. On that reading, Jacob was the younger brother, by a year or two, or by more. The second is the standard position of the Eastern churches, and it is older than the argument itself. Joseph was a widower with sons when he married Mary, so the brothers are his by a first marriage, which makes them older than Jesus, possibly by a good many years. The third comes from Jerome at the end of the 4th century, in a furious reply to a man named Helvidius, who had argued the first position in public. Jerome's answer was cousins. It rests on the fact that Hebrew and Aramaic use the word for brother across a far wider range of kinship than Greek does, and on a tangle of names among the women at the cross. It became, and remains, the Roman Catholic position. I cannot settle a 1600-year-old argument in a video about somebody's brother, and I am not going to try. But watch what each option does to the man standing in the road. If Jacob was younger, then this is a story about a younger brother watching the head of his household walk away, inheriting a burden he did not choose, and reacting the way younger brothers react, which is with a mixture of resentment and fear that gets read as concern. If Jacob was older, then it is a completely different story. It is the story of an elder brother, legally and morally responsible for the conduct of the family, watching a younger sibling do something that endangers everyone, and doing what an elder brother in that world was obligated to do about it. And if they were cousins, then the whole thing takes place inside an extended clan, in a village where everyone was related to everyone anyway, and the intervention becomes a decision by the wider family network rather than one household. 3 readings, 3 very different men, and the sources are not going to tell us which. What all 3 have in common is this. Somebody in that family was responsible for keeping the rest of them fed and respectable, and somewhere around the year 28 or 29, a man from that household went down to the Jordan, got baptized by a preacher the authorities would shortly execute, and never came home to stay. Capernaum, on the northwestern shore of the lake, around the year 29. It is not a large town, but compared to Nazareth it is a different world. It sits on a trade road. It has a customs post, which means Roman-backed tax collection and the resentment that comes with it. It has a fishing economy, boats, a harbour, a synagogue, whose later foundations you can still walk through. And at some point, early in the ministry, according to Matthew, Jesus left Nazareth and settled there, 30 miles or so from home. On foot across the hills, that is a day and a half of walking, more if you are travelling with women and taking the safer roads. Far enough to be a separate life, close enough that everything came back. Try to reconstruct what was reaching Nazareth in those months, because the family were reacting to rumours coming back down the road from the lake. Crowds, large enough that Mark describes a house so packed that people cut a hole in the roof to lower a paralyzed man through it. Exorcisms in public with shouting. A running fight with Pharisees about the Sabbath in a province where Sabbath observance was one of the few markers of identity the occupation could not confiscate. An incident in which he told a man his sins were forgiven, and the word blasphemy entered the conversation. In that period, that word carried a capital charge. Table fellowship with tax collectors, which in a village economy is roughly the social equivalent of dining with the bailiff who repossessed your neighbor's field, and a following that had picked up, among others, a customs official, and at least one man carrying a nickname that may have marked him as a religious hardliner. Now put that in front of a household in an occupied province, 60 years after Rome installed the Herods, 30 years after a revolt in Galilee was put down and the nearby town of Sepphoris was burned and its population sold, and roughly 40 years before the whole country would go up in flames and the temple would come down. People in that world had seen what happened to charismatic Galileans who gathered crowds. There was a standard outcome, and it was not a long career, so the family went to get him. Notice what that costs. It is not a phone call. It is a 2-day round trip minimum, probably longer, for a household that survives on daily labor, undertaken by several members at once, in a farming and building economy where days do not come back. Whatever else this was, it was not a casual gesture. Somebody made a decision that the situation had become an emergency. And this is where I think the story usually gets flattened in the retelling in both directions. The devotional version turns the family into cardboard obstacles, a set of doubters placed in the narrative so the hero can rise above them. The cynical version turns them into cowards, protecting their own comfort. Neither reading survives contact with how families in that world actually functioned. There were no institutions for the mentally ill, none. No asylums, no physicians who took the case, no state that would intervene. If a man in your household began behaving in ways the community read as possession or derangement, the responsibility for containing it fell on the family, legally and morally and completely. And containment meant exactly what the Greek says: physical restraint applied by relatives, followed by taking him home and keeping him there. In their own terms, that is the behavior of people trying to save him, and it is what the community would have expected them to do. But both things can be true at once, and here they almost certainly were, because the same act that rescued him would also rescue them. If the Jerusalem delegation's verdict stuck, if it became the settled opinion of the religious establishment that this man was operating with demonic power, then the household in Nazareth was finished, not metaphorically. Marriages would not happen, contracts would not come, and the sisters would carry it for the rest of their lives. Love and self-preservation pointing in exactly the same direction, which is how most families behave under pressure. They arrived. The door did not open. What Mark describes is a public refusal. The mother and the brothers stand outside a crowded house, in front of an audience, and send a message in. It is passed along, and the reply that comes back out, in front of everyone, is that his real mother and his real brothers are the people already sitting inside. In a shame-based culture, that is a household being publicly demoted in front of witnesses by its own son, in a town where the story would be repeated by nightfall. And if you are Jacob, standing in that street, the message you just received is that the man you walked 30 miles to save has replaced you with strangers. Whatever he felt about the claims, whatever he believed or disbelieved about the kingdom of God, he had just been humiliated. And that is a wound that does not require any theology at all to explain. A second collision follows, and Mark puts it a few chapters later. Jesus comes back to Nazareth and teaches in the synagogue, and the village turns on him. In Mark's version, there is no violence in it, just something slower and more corrosive. They list his relatives out loud. They name his trade. They ask who he thinks he is. And Jesus answers with a line that everyone half remembers and almost nobody quotes in full. A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and among his own relatives and in his own house. 3 clauses, and the circle tightens across them, from the town to the relatives to the house itself. Watch what happens to that line afterward. Matthew keeps it and drops the middle clause about relatives. Luke removes the setting entirely and rewrites the whole episode into a different and much more dramatic scene in which the villagers try to throw him off a hilltop. The relatives disappear from the sentence, and Mark ends the passage with a statement that should stop you cold. He says that Jesus could do no work of power there, apart from a few healings, and that he was amazed at their lack of trust. Matthew, using Mark, changes could not into did not. The same pattern over and over. The earliest version is the roughest. Every later hand smooths it. The last scene we have of the brothers before the crucifixion comes from John, and it is the sharpest of the 3. It is autumn at the festival of Sukkot, one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts when Jerusalem fills with people from across the country. The brothers tell him to leave Galilee and go up to Judea so his followers there can see what he's doing. Nobody who wants to be publicly known, they tell him, works in secret. If he is going to do these things, he should show himself to the world. On the surface it reads like advice. Read it again and it reads like a dare. Because John has already told us in the same passage that the authorities in Judea were looking for an opportunity to kill him, which means the brothers are either being careless with his life or they are calling his bluff. Go on then. Do it in the capital, in front of the people who matter, and let's see what you actually are. Then John's narrator adds the line, flat and unhedged, in his own voice. Not even his brothers believed in him, not the crowd and not the Pharisees, but his brothers. And John, who spends his entire gospel arguing that belief is the thing that matters most, chose to leave that sentence in. Here is the part that is easy to skip past. Depending on which gospel's chronology you follow, the public ministry ran somewhere between 1 and 3 years. Every single scene we have involving the family falls inside it. There is no reconciliation scene. There is no moment where the brothers come around, no gradual warming, no quiet reversal reported by anybody. Which means that as far as the written record goes, the estrangement lasted the entire time, the whole ministry, beginning to end. It ended the way everyone in that world would have predicted it would end for a Galilean who gathered crowds and argued with the temple. It ended on a Roman cross outside the city wall at Passover, in front of a holiday crowd, with a placard nailed above his head announcing the charge. For a family that had spent 3 years insisting he was going to get himself killed, there is a terrible arithmetic in that. They had been right. Everything they had said, everything they had walked 30 miles to prevent, had just happened exactly as they said it would. The question this whole video exists to ask is, what on earth could have happened next? Every gospel names people at the crucifixion. It is worth going through the lists slowly because of who is in them and who is not. Mark, the earliest, says there were women watching from a distance. He names 3, Mary Magdalene, Salome, and Mary, whom he identifies as the mother of James the Younger and of Joses. Stop on that third one. James and Joses are 2 of the 4 names in the Nazareth roster, 2 brothers of Jesus. So either Mark is naming Jesus' own mother, and at the crucifixion of her son, declining to call her his mother, which would be one of the oddest editorial choices in the New Testament. Or he is naming a different woman who happens to have the most common female name in the country and 2 sons with 2 of the most common male names in the country. Scholars have been going back and forth on that for a very long time, and there is no agreement. Both options are strange. Pick whichever strangeness you prefer. What is not ambiguous is the other half of the list, no brothers. not in Mark, not in Matthew, not in Luke, not in John. Not named, not implied, not present at a distance. In every account we have of the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, no member of his household is recorded as being there except possibly his mother. John gives us a scene the others do not, and it is the most socially loaded moment in the entire Passion narrative. His mother is standing near the cross with 2 or 3 other women and one male disciple, the one John never names and always calls the disciple whom Jesus loved. And from the cross, Jesus assigns her to him. He tells his mother that this man is now her son. He tells the disciple that this woman is now his mother. And John adds that from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. Read that as theology, and it is beautiful. A new family being formed at the foot of the cross, defined by loyalty rather than blood, which is exactly the redefinition Jesus made in the Capernaum doorway years earlier. John almost certainly means it that way. Now read it as social history. In that world, a widow was the responsibility of her sons. Full stop. It was the basic architecture of survival for women without property, and this woman had, on any of the 3 theories we went through, at least 4 adult males in her extended household. And in front of witnesses, at the moment of death, her eldest is recorded handing her to somebody outside the family. I want to be fair to the other side of this, because the counter-argument is genuinely strong. If the brothers did not believe, entrusting her to someone who did is coherent, even kind. John is a theological writer with an agenda about who the true family is, and whatever the arrangement was, it clearly did not become permanent, because the mother turns up shortly afterward in the same room as the brothers. But even granting all of that, notice what nobody in the early church did with this scene. Nobody wrote a version in which the brothers were there. Nobody inserted a deathbed reconciliation. In 4 independent accounts of the most important death in the tradition, the household is simply missing, and none of the 4 writers appears to feel the need to explain why. One more absence, and it is the loudest. The burial was arranged by Joseph of Arimathea, described as a member of the council. Burying the dead was the most binding obligation a Jewish family had, more binding than almost any other religious duty. It was performed by a man who was not a relative. And now we get to the thing that makes Jacob's later career so difficult to explain, and it has nothing to do with grief. In Deuteronomy, there is a law about a man who has committed a capital crime and whose body is hung up afterward as a public display. The body must not remain on the wood overnight, because a man hanged is under God's curse, and leaving him there defiles the land. By the 1st century, that law was being applied directly to crucifixion. We know this because one of the scrolls found at Qumran, a text laying out a program of Torah for a purified Israel, takes the Deuteronomy law and applies it explicitly to the practice of hanging a living man on a tree. The connection was already made in Hebrew by Jews before Christianity existed. Paul, who knew exactly what he was doing, quotes that same law in the letter to the Galatians when he talks about the cross. So put yourself inside the head of a Torah-observant Galilean Jew on the Sabbath after Passover. Your brother claimed or was claimed by others to be the one Israel had been waiting for, the one who would restore the kingdom, drive out the occupier, and set the world right. There were various versions of that expectation floating around in that century, and they disagreed with each other about a great deal. What none of them included was a candidate who gets arrested by the temple leadership, handed to a Roman prefect, flogged, and publicly executed as a political criminal under a sign advertising the charge. Under the terms of the expectation itself, that was the disproof. And under the law, in the plainest possible reading, it was worse than disproof. It was a curse. Everything Jacob had believed about his brother had just been confirmed by the most authoritative process available. The religious establishment agreed, the imperial power agreed, and the Torah, read straight, agreed. He had been right, and being right had cost him his brother. If you are still with me this far in, that is the part of these stories I find worth doing. The ordinary human wreckage underneath the text, rather than the miracles or the debunking. Subscribe, and you get one of these every week, built the same way. One overlooked person, one hole in the record, and no pretending the hole is not there. And there was a second weight on him that had nothing to do with any of that. They never fixed it. The last recorded exchange between Jesus and his household was a public refusal at a doorway. The last recorded words from the brothers were a taunt at a festival. There was no reconciliation scene, no quiet conversation, no working it out. And now there could not be one. Ever. Anybody who has lost somebody in the middle of an argument knows the specific shape of that. It is grief with a locked door in it. So that is where the story of Jacob of Nazareth should end. A man in his 30s, in a village of a few hundred people, carrying a dead father's workshop, a mother, unmarried sisters, a family name now attached to a Roman execution, and an unfinished fight with a brother he could not apologize to and could not forgive. By every measure available to us, he should be a footnote, a name in a list of relatives, remembered by nobody. Now, while the household in Nazareth was absorbing all of that, something was happening about 90 miles south, in Jerusalem, among a group of people who had no blood relationship to Jesus at all, and who had also, most of them, run. And somewhere in the space between those two facts, in a gap of perhaps a few weeks, everything about Jacob's life reversed. The earliest surviving account of what Christians claimed about the resurrection is not in any gospel. It is in a letter Paul wrote to a fractious congregation in Corinth, somewhere in the middle of the 50s, roughly 20 years after the crucifixion and probably 15 or 20 years before Mark was written down. And in the middle of that letter, Paul does something a careful reader notices immediately. He stops writing in his own voice and starts reciting. He says he is handing on what he himself received. Those two verbs in that pairing are the standard technical language for transmitting a fixed tradition, the way a student receives a formula from a teacher and passes it along unaltered. Then comes a short, rhythmic, tightly structured list with vocabulary Paul does not otherwise use, and with Peter appearing under his Aramaic name rather than the Greek one Paul normally prefers. Pay attention to what follows, because it is the closest thing we have to a contemporary document, and it contains the exact moment this whole video has been walking toward. Scholars across the whole spectrum, including people with no religious commitment whatsoever, generally agree that Paul is quoting something older than himself. How much older is argued about. The estimates run from within a couple of decades to within a couple of years of the crucifixion, and a number of specialists put it startlingly early. The list goes like this. He appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then to more than 500 at once, most of whom Paul says are still alive and can be asked, then to James, then to all the apostles, then to James. That is the entire account. 4 words in English, 3 in Greek, sitting in a list, with no location, no date, no description, no dialogue, no witnesses, no aftermath. Now compare that with how the tradition handles everybody else. Mary Magdalene gets a scene in a garden with mistaken identity and a name spoken aloud. The road to Emmaus gets a long walk, a conversation about scripture, and a recognition at a meal. Thomas gets a week of doubt and an invitation to put his hand in a wound. Peter gets a charcoal fire on a beach in Galilee and a threefold question that everybody who has read the Passion narrative understands immediately. The brother, who had been publicly hostile for the entire ministry, who was about to run the Jerusalem church for 30 years and who would be executed for it, gets one clause in a list. And this is the part that still does not make sense to me. Paul knew James personally, not by reputation. In Galatians, he says that 3 years after his own turnaround, he went up to Jerusalem, spent 15 days with Peter, and saw no other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. Later, he describes negotiating with him directly. Later still, he describes a serious conflict involving men who came from him. Paul had the story available to him. He had 2 weeks in Jerusalem with the 2 men at the center of it. And when he writes the single most important passage in his entire theology about what happened after the crucifixion, he gives the brother 4 words. Either the detailed story was so universally known that it needed no telling, which is possible for the 50s, but does not explain why it vanished afterward, or nobody was telling it, or somebody had decided it was better not to. Luke gives us the other half of the puzzle, and he gives it just as flatly. At the start of Acts, in the room in Jerusalem where the surviving followers gather, he lists who is present, the 11 by name, certain women, Mary the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. There they are, with no explanation and no note about what changed, no scene, no dialogue, no acknowledgement that this is remarkable in any way. And remember who is writing. This is the same author who took Mark's sentence about the family setting out to restrain him for madness and quietly removed it. Luke will not narrate the fight, and Luke will not narrate the reconciliation. He shows you the household outside the door in Galilee, softened, and then he shows you the household inside the room in Jerusalem, unexplained, and he leaves the 20 miles and the several weeks between them completely dark. Note also that Luke lists them as their own group, standing apart from the disciples rather than folded in among them, the brothers as a unit. By roughly a decade later, one of them is the man Peter names before going into hiding. There is exactly one narrative of the appearance to James in the ancient world, and it comes from a book we no longer have. Jerome, writing at the end of the 4th century, quotes from a text he calls the Gospel according to the Hebrews, a Jewish Christian gospel that circulated for centuries and then disappeared, surviving only in fragments quoted by people arguing about something else. In the fragment, James has sworn an oath. He will not eat bread from the hour he drank the cup of the Lord until he sees him risen from the dead. Then Jesus appears, takes bread, blesses it, breaks it, gives it to him, and tells him to eat, because the Son of Man has risen. It is a lovely scene, and there is a serious problem with it. It assumes James was present at the Last Supper, which contradicts everything in the canonical material, where the brothers are absent, unbelieving, and nowhere near the upper room. The fragment does not fill the gap so much as pretend the gap was never there, which tells you something anyway. By the 2nd or 3rd century, somebody had noticed the silence and found it intolerable enough to write a scene into it. Here the evidence stops and the interpretation starts, and I am going to lay out the options as fairly as I can, rather than pretend one of them is obvious. The traditional reading is the simplest. Something happened that James understood as an encounter with his brother, alive. Defenders of this reading press one particular point hard, and it is a legitimate one. Hostile witnesses who convert are unusual. Hostile witnesses who convert, take over the movement, spend 30 years leading it, and then accept execution rather than back down are considerably more unusual. Whatever you conclude about the metaphysics, something has to account for the behavior. That is the strongest case on that side, and it deserves to be stated at its strongest rather than waved at. The psychological reading says grief and guilt did the work. Visionary experiences of the recently dead are well documented in bereavement literature and are not rare, particularly where the relationship ended badly. A man who publicly called his brother insane, refused to be at the execution, and then had to live with that, could plausibly experience something overwhelming. Critics of this reading point out that James does not fit the usual profile because he was not a devoted follower whose hopes had collapsed. He was the skeptic. And a private vision does not obviously produce a 30-year career running a Torah-observant messianic community in the capital. The political reading says the movement did what Jewish movements of the period tended to do, which is close ranks around the family. Relatives of Jesus held recognized status in the Eastern churches for generations and were tracked, according to one early source, all the way into the reigns of later emperors. James is succeeded, according to that same source, by a cousin. On this reading, the leadership passed to the household by dynastic logic, and the appearance tradition ratified afterward what kinship had already decided. A maximal version of this argument was pushed hard by one 20th century scholar and is rejected by most of the field. A moderate version is taken seriously by a lot of people, and then there is the option almost nobody raises, which I happen to think is the most interesting of the four. That the family opposition was never really about whether Jesus was who he said he was, that it was about method and danger and timing and a household's survival. On that reading, the brothers were not skeptics in the modern sense at all, and the gap between Sukkot and the upper room is narrower than it looks. Pick your explanation. They are not all equally likely, and I have my own view, but I am aware that my view is doing work that the evidence itself does not do. What the sources actually let us say is narrower and stranger than any of the four. Before the crucifixion, the brothers of Jesus do not believe in him, and two independent traditions say so. After the crucifixion, they are in the room, and one of them is in charge, and not a single writer in the 1st century, including one who knew the man personally and spent 2 weeks in his city, thought it was worth writing down how, whatever happened, it worked. Within about 15 years of the crucifixion, Paul is describing the leadership of the Jerusalem church as 3 men, and he calls them the ones reputed to be pillars. He lists James, Cephas, and John in that order. Read that order again. Peter, the man with the keys in Matthew, the man on the beach in John, the man who preaches the first sermon in Acts, is named second by a writer who is not particularly interested in flattering the Jerusalem leadership and who spends the surrounding paragraphs making it clear he does not consider himself their subordinate. At the council in Jerusalem, where the movement decides whether Gentile converts have to become Jews first, Luke gives the sequence carefully. Peter speaks. Barnabas and Paul report. And then James delivers the ruling, quotes the prophet Amos, and states his judgment. The letter that goes out to the churches carries his terms. That is the profile of the man in charge. And he and Paul did not get along. That is on the page, in Paul's own handwriting, still angry. In Galatians, Paul describes a scene in Antioch where Peter had been eating with Gentile believers, which in that context meant sharing a table across the purity boundary. Then, Paul says, certain men came from James, and Peter pulled back, and Barnabas went with him, and Paul confronted Peter in front of everyone. We do not know whether those men were carrying James's actual instructions or freelancing under his name, and Paul, who had every reason to say if it were the former, does not quite say it. But the shape of the disagreement is clear enough. James was leading a community of Jewish believers in the temple city who had not stopped being Jewish, who kept the law, and who were watching a former persecutor tell Gentiles across the empire that the law was not the point. The last time they appear together in Acts, that tension is doing something interesting. Paul arrives in Jerusalem for the final time. James and the elders receive him, and they tell him there are many thousands of Jewish believers in the city, all of them zealous for the law, and all of them hearing that Paul teaches Jews abroad to abandon it. So they propose a solution. 4 men in the community are under a Nazirite vow. Let Paul go through the purification rites with them and pay their expenses, publicly, so everyone can see that he keeps the law himself. And Paul, the apostle of freedom from the law, agrees and does it. Days later, he is seized in the temple courts, and the entire last quarter of Acts becomes the story of his custody, his hearings, and his journey to Rome in chains. James is not mentioned again, not a word about what he did or said or thought about any of it. Luke simply drops him. A short letter in the New Testament carries his name, and it does not read like anything else in the collection. It is addressed to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. It is closer to Jewish wisdom literature than to Paul's argumentative style. It hammers relentlessly on the treatment of the poor, on employers withholding wages, on the rich being flattered in the assembly, on the tongue, on the gap between what people say they believe and what they actually do. It is saturated with the teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, in phrasing and content, and it never once quotes Jesus by name. And the author, in the opening line, calls himself a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, with nothing about being his brother, his relative, or a member of that household at all. Whether the historical James wrote it is genuinely contested, and the arguments run both ways, mostly around the quality of the Greek, but the restraint in that opening line is worth sitting with either way. If it is authentic, the man who once stood outside a door in Capernaum wrote a letter to the whole diaspora, and did not use the one credential that would have settled every argument in advance. It also contains the passage about faith without works being dead, which Martin Luther found so obstructive to his reading of Paul that in the preface to his 1522 New Testament, he called it an epistle of straw. He softened the judgment in later editions and dropped the phrase, but it never stopped following him around. By the 2nd century, stories about him had hardened into something close to legend. A writer named Hegesippus, quoted at length by the church historian Eusebius, gives a portrait. James was called the Just. He drank no wine and ate no meat. No razor touched his head. He used no oil, took no baths, wore only linen. He was permitted, Hegesippus says, into the sanctuary itself, and he knelt in prayer so constantly, asking forgiveness for his people, that the skin on his knees hardened like a camel's. I would not put money on the details. This is a source writing a century after the fact, in a genre that idealizes its subjects, describing privileges in the temple that no ordinary Jew was granted. But the shape of the memory is consistent with everything else we know. He was remembered as scrupulously observant, and he was remembered as respected well beyond his own movement, which is the only reason we can date his death at all. In the year 62, the Roman procurator of Judea, Porcius Festus, died while in office. His replacement, Lucius Albinus, was still traveling from Alexandria. For a period of weeks, the province had no governor. Josephus tells us what happened in the gap. The high priest was Ananus, son of the Ananus who appears in the Passion narratives. Josephus describes him as bold and as belonging to a party notoriously harsh in judgment. He calculated that with Festus dead and Albinus not yet arrived, he had a window in which nobody could overrule him. He convened the council, brought in James, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, along with some others, accused them of breaking the law, and handed them over to be stoned. And then something revealing happened. The most reasonable citizens of the city, the ones Josephus describes as strict in observance of the law, were outraged. They sent word to King Agrippa. Some of them went out to meet Albinus on the road, to complain that Ananus had convened a court without authorization. Albinus wrote Ananus a furious letter. Agrippa removed him from the high priesthood after 3 months. Read that carefully, because it is the most useful piece of information in the whole account. The men who objected to the execution of James were the observant Jewish establishment of Jerusalem, with no stake in his movement at all, and they were angry enough to end a high priest's career over it. Hegesippus gives a much more elaborate version, in which James is thrown from the parapet of the temple, stoned when the fall does not kill him, and finished with a club by a cloth worker, while praying for the people doing it. Some of that may preserve real memory. Some of it is clearly shaped by the crucifixion narrative, right down to the prayer, and honest history has to say so. Either way, the man who once tried to bring his brother home in restraints died in the same city, under a similar charge, refusing to take any of it back. His cousin Simeon took over. Before the Roman war closed in, the community is said to have left Jerusalem for a town across the Jordan. The temple came down in 70. The Jewish wing of the movement, the one James had built, shrank over the following centuries into a handful of groups that the rest of the church eventually regarded as heretical. And the church that survived and spread was, overwhelmingly, Paul's. One last thing closed, from much earlier. That whisper in Nazareth, the one buried in the phrase "Son of Mary," outlived every person in this story. It surfaces again in the 2nd century, in the work of a pagan critic named Celsus, who built an entire attack on Christianity out of it, and it echoes in Jewish counter-traditions for centuries afterward. None of that is evidence about what happened in Nazareth. It is evidence that the village gossip got a longer run than the village did, which produces one last irony. The brother of Jesus, who ran the mother church of the entire movement for 30 years and died for it, ended up a supporting character in a story shaped by a man who never met Jesus at all. One footnote before we finish. In 2002, a limestone bone box surfaced on the antiquities market with an Aramaic inscription reading, "James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus." It set off one of the longest forgery trials in Israeli history. The state's experts said part of the inscription was modern. The owner was acquitted in 2012, and the judge said explicitly that acquittal did not mean the box was authentic. Because it came from the market rather than from an excavation, nobody can say where it was found, which means the argument cannot be settled and probably never will be. Fitting, really. Even his coffin is disputed. Go back to the road. A family walking north out of Nazareth in the spring, a day and a half of hard ground, carrying between them the intention of laying hands on one of their own and bringing him home before he destroyed all of them. One of the men on that road is named Jacob, and he is doing exactly what a brother in that world was supposed to do. 30 years later, he is on his knees on the stone floor of the temple, the calluses gone hard, asking forgiveness for a city that is about to kill him. The Gospels tell us where he started. Josephus tells us where he ended. Everything in between is the largest unexplained gap in the New Testament, and the people best placed to fill it are the ones who chose not to. So the question to leave with is not whether something happened to Jacob of Nazareth. Something obviously did. The question is why the men who knew exactly what it was decided that the one story worth leaving out was the story of the brother who changed his mind. The video on screen now is the closest thing to this one on the channel. Another man the record went quiet about, and the same silence doing the same work.